you all for being here today. My name is Zhang Chen. I'm a philosopher and chair of the Idea Lab Beyond Gender, Reimagining Diversity, Plurality, and Philosophy. Our lab was established last summer with the goal to explore the significance of diversity and plurality in their various forms, and to create spaces for meaningful conversations both within philosophy and across disciplines. Today's event is an exciting step in that direction. At the heart of today's discussion is Capoeira Angola, an Afro-Brazilian martial arts that blends movement, music, and strategic play. But beyond its physical practice, Capoeira Angola is deeply tied to colonial history, resistance, and embodied knowledge, making it a rich site for interdisciplinary exploration. So we are honored to have Dr. Dafni Louzioti, also with a Chinese name, Lu Zhiyun, a performer, teacher, and academic, to guide us through this topic. Originally from Greece, Dafni holds a PhD in theater and performance from Goldsmiths, specializing in participatory performance and power relations. With a background spanning dance, theater, martial arts, visual arts, she works at the intersection of movement, performance, and critical inquiry. Dafni has been teaching Capoeira Angola since 2006 and was recognized as a contramaestra, the second highest rank in the art, in 2019. Joining the conversation as discussants are Professor Yang from 政治 University, who is an expert in performance, contemporary Western theater, and modern Taiwanese theater. Yanshu is also a very experienced coach of Tai Chi Dao. And we also have Professor Lin Yingtong from阳明交通大学 National阳明交通 University, who is a philosopher of cognitive science, specializing in psychology, memory, and consciousness, with additional work in neuroethics and AI ethics. So here is how the session will unfold today. Dafni will begin with her lecture for about an hour. Then we will have a short break. After that, Yanshu and Yingtong will share their comments before we open the floor for discussion. This event is truly interdisciplinary and experimental, and I'm excited for the conversation ahead. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Louzioti.
Hi, thank you everyone. I'll probably stand up, I think better on my feet. Okay, so I'll go through quite a few big ideas today. The main one is that power relations and ideas around power can be negotiated through the body in action, within the frame of play. That's quite an important distinction here. So, what I'd like to do, before I go into any big theories or any definitions, is I'd like to share with you some audio visuals of Capoeira Angola. You'll already see that I've picked two different games in two different places. One is from 1994 in Brazil, in the center of Capoeira Angola. And one is from 2018 in London, in the UK. And I'd just like you to observe if there are any questions that arise from this, please make a note of them. I'd love to discuss and answer any queries that even the beginning might bring up. So hopefully this will work. We tested the sound. It's not really. I'm sorry, I'm having technical problems. I don't know why. It's worked perfectly. This is not good. We tried it earlier, I'm so sorry. And we start with a bump. Let me try. I'm going to go here. There we go. This should work. Took me a second. I apologize. Stop that there for now. You will probably have noticed a number of things. There's live music, there's a circle of people responding to the verbal cue of the singing, and there are all sorts of actions happening, which I can unpack shortly. But before we unpack that, I'd like you to just notice the similarities and differences of the same game, of the same structure of game, played many years later in a very different part of the world. Okay. Go back to my presenter view. Oh, sorry. Presenter view. There. Sorry, I'm not the best with technology. Right. So, now it's playing out. There we go. Sorry, I'm not sure why that. There we go. I promised no more on that. I remember the years. Now I can actually talk. Right, so what you've seen is how Capoeira Angola is practiced currently. This is one of the most common setups for the form. Outdoors, often, although it does also happen in indoor spaces. A circle of people is formed with live percussion music, call and response, singing, and two people playing in the middle. All these roles are interchangeable. So if I've had a physical game with somebody, I can then go out from the center of the circle to stand or sit in the singing circle, or I can go pick up an instrument and play. So we train all of these things so that we can make the ritual happen, the game happen. You can see that it's made up of many different disciplines. It is a martial art, it is a game, it has elements of dance. It is a fight, usually a ritual one rather than a full-on impact one, although that does also happen. And there is a ritual element to it. Sorry, I'm talking a little bit, aren't I? There is a ritual element to it. So there are certain rules, for lack of a better word, that guide behaviors. There are certain things that need to happen in a particular order for a sort of collective attention to be generated, so that we enter into a sphere of aesthetic play. So we're not just thinking attack and defense, we're thinking aesthetics, we're thinking kinesthetic response to music, kinesthetic response to gesture. So it's quite a layered practice. It originates in Brazil. It is an Afro-Brazilian form, meaning that although it's got influences from the Portuguese language and indigenous elements, primarily it is of Central West African origin. And that sounds broad, and it is, because there are different, more specific cultural groups that have informed this practice. Different waves of, different phases of the transatlantic slave trade took people from different parts of Central West Africa. So there are physical elements from the Bantu Congo, there are linguistic elements from the Bantu people, but also the Ifa and Yoruba people. So there's a real mix of practices that inform this very particular practice. It's not a uniform practice, and it's not a regulated practice. It is absolutely an oral tradition. So different regions of Brazil have slightly different variations of capoeira, and Capoeira Angola more specifically. And I say Capoeira Angola because there are different styles or different lineages of capoeira. This is a particular style that developed in Bahia, in Brazil, the province of Bahia in the northeast of Brazil, just under the tooth of South America. That's how I call it, the little edge pointing to Africa. So just under that is Bahia. And Capoeira Angola emerged there as a response to different changes that were happening to the practice. This, I think, is not our core interest here, but it emerged in this form roughly in the 1940s with this name. People practice it for different reasons. For some, it is a way of reconnecting to their African roots, a way of practicing Black identity in Brazil. For others, it's a fun pastime. For others, it's a way of finding self-expression, even though it's a specific movement language that we play with. And it's practiced sometimes in the street. Sometimes people learn in more formalized academies, sometimes in gyms or even dance schools. It is now a global art, so you can find it pretty much on every continent except Antarctica. That said, although it's spread all over the world, it's still quite a small practice. There are very few people relatively practicing it. Okay, so to go into more detail, we've already looked at the fact that it's played to live music. It's got a call and response structure both in the movement and the music. And more importantly, all of these things, other than an interesting pastime, for me and other scholars, it is an embodied epistemology. It is a system of knowledge that is generated and communicated primarily through the body, through action. Although the music is quite important, and the lyrics can be metaphors for struggle, or metaphors for remembering past and slavery, the primary generator of knowledge, I would say, is the physical interplay. So with that comes certain ideas. Ideas of resistance, ideas of trickery, ideas of trying to overcome the impossible. And that becomes a philosophy in practice. I cannot play capoeira without thinking. I cannot play capoeira mindlessly. I have to be very present and very aware of what I'm doing, what my partner is doing, what the music is doing around. I just need to check what I'm doing next. Yes, there we go. I'm going to move on so I can explain what I mean more. This idea of philosophy and practice. So, when people first see Capoeira Angola, it might not be clear what is going on, what is the intention. Why are people not hitting each other? Why are people... Because we see a kick, and somebody escaping it, and maybe the kick will be pulled or will be made purposefully slow. And there might be a question of, well, if this is a martial art, why are they not kicking each other? Why is there so much expression? Why the acrobatics? Why do they keep stopping? What is all this business? Our intention in the game is to dominate our partner. At least I speak from my experience and what I've been taught from my teachers. It is a game of power. I go in to try and dominate my partner, and that is a very broad intention. My partner might be much bigger than me, much stronger than me. They might be smaller than me, more or less experienced than me. So what does it mean to try and dominate my partner? There are so many ways of approaching this. If I take it from the most obvious, if I'm bigger, stronger, and faster than my opponent, I can block their options of movement by moving around them. I can try and physically overpower them, but that is generally looked down upon in Capoeira Angola. We're not interested in physically overpowering or hitting directly. There's no play in that. That borders aggression, and we want to play. Play dangerously, but play. So I can dominate my partner by removing their options for movement, by moving around them, blocking their pathway. I can dominate my partner by making them move too much and tiring them out, therefore uncovering their weak spots, so then I have an opportunity to maybe actually deliver a kick or a headbutt or a sweep, as we saw in the second video. But there are other ways of negotiating power here. I can try and charm my opponent into letting their guard down. I can try and confuse them by setting up physical rhythmic patterns and breaking them. And that sounds all quite abstract, I realize, but I'm trying to share a few ideas about how power play happens in Capoeira Angola. And hopefully we can go into more detail if that is of interest. What is quite central to the thinking around power in Capoeira Angola is that power is not fixed. It always shifts. So this idea of dominating comes with the understanding that even if I manage to dominate my partner for a little bit, that situation is likely to shift because they're also trying to dominate me. And here comes the other important and distinguishing element of Capoeira Angola. There is no winner or loser. There is no fixed end state. The game ends, and off we go, and then two more come to play. So today I might have maybe a little bit more dominance over the game, over my partner. The next day, if I play with the same person, maybe they have more dominance over me. Who knows, maybe it will just keep shifting. So this idea that power and who has the upper hand, so to speak, is never fixed. So we're working with an impossible task, we're working with contradiction from the beginning. And this is crucial. So for a little bit of context, Capoeira came out of a situation full of contradictions, a situation of dehumanization, conditions of slavery. Even when slavery was abolished, most Afro-Brazilians lived in dire conditions of poverty and discrimination. Life was not easy. Capoeira Angola can be understood as a way of recuperating agency, even personhood, by asserting dominance, by trying to assert dominance in this game of power, but also knowing that actually I can never have complete power or complete dominion over somebody else. It keeps shifting. But it also becomes something very collective, because I can't play by myself. I can't have an interdisciplinary aesthetic combat game without other people playing music. I can't find this concentration that the ritual of Capoeira Angola provides, or affords through its series of elements, without other people. I'm sort of dependent on what we do together, even when it comes to me trying to go, I am here. But the I am here is also witnessed. So it's very much an interrelated collective practice. Christina Hauser talks about Capoeira Angola as a means of recuperating, inventing identity. Historically, Brazil tried to repress expressions of Afro-Brazilian culture. Languages, religious practices, secular practices, and art forms. They have re-emerged in different forms over the years, with modifications, with appropriations along the way. But Capoeira Angola remains very obviously Afro-diasporic in its aesthetic. And it doesn't sit easily in aesthetic or cultural categories. It's neither fully one thing or another. And that becomes a space of freedom in some ways to try and find how one can be. How can I find agency in this constructed situation, in this impossible situation of attempting dominance? So Hauser talks about this idea of recuperating identity in that it's a reclaiming of Africanness or blackness through this practice. And the inventing part comes through the more recent reincorporation of more clearly African elements into the practice. The introduction of Yoruba words more evidently. The reintroduction of certain African patterns in clothes or hats or trousers that people choose to wear. The discourse around blackness. So all of that becomes a very contemporary way of trying to remember, to recuperate something that was attempted to be disappeared. And something that is reconstituted in the contemporary sense. So that is already quite a powerful context for practice. And it's not done just through discourse, it's done by turning up. By turning up and by moving. It's let's say, the symbolic upturning of the normative order. I will be upside down. I will be bent. I will be twisted. So, through practice, people are making statements about aesthetics, about culture, about identity. So far, so good. Just checking that I haven't missed anything. All good. On we go. I want to talk about power play a little bit more And this is a quote again by Cristina Rosa, who's written on the aesthetic of the ginga. The ginga is a word used in Brazil to express not just swaying, but a concept of springiness and adaptation and adaptability. And she ties that to different cultural practices and how it's manifested in Brazil. One of them is Capoeira Angola. And she talks about Capoeira in this way. I won't read it out if it helps. On top of that, circles of Capoeira Angola may be approached as protective and permissive arenas inside which players haggle, break down, mock, and surprise one another, seeking to tilt or revert the asymmetrical negotiations of power relations in their favor. So we're talking about a marginalized class of people negotiating symbolically, but also in actuality, in this microcosm of the other, relations of power. So you can see that this has quite a few layers of metaphor and literal meaning. And all of this is done physically. We don't go in saying, I will do this now. I go in and I look at my partner and shake their hand. Off we go. I'd like to just take a step back now, because I've sort of given you quite a lot of big ideas. And I've talked about embodied knowledge and working through the body to negotiate ideas, to generate ideas. So I want to just take a step back and frame how I use the idea of embodied knowledge for this context. It's not the only idea, and I don't want to offer a survey of literature. I want to focus on the fact that, first of all, on a very technical level, all knowledge is embodied. The duality of mind and body separation comes from a very specific cultural viewpoint, and that's what it is. But it's not a universal idea, and I challenge that idea not just because there are other cultures and other people talking about it, and I will refer to just a couple of examples. It comes from my own practice. It comes from my lived experience of practicing Capoeira Angola, as well as other practices, but today I focus on Capoeira Angola. So my definition is quite broad. It's knowledge that is gained and exchanged predominantly through action, sensorially, and through interaction with people in the material world. So it is very much action-based, even if it's myself working with myself. Sometimes it's very relational also. Lakoff and Johnson in Philosophy in the Flesh make some very clear claims about embodied knowledge. So they talk about the sensory motor system, which includes our perceptive senses and our, motor system. If we take the idea that concepts use part of the sensory motor system, everything is embodied. And if, as they believe, concepts are embodied in this strong sense, philosophical consequences are enormous. The locus of reason would be the same as the locus for perception and motor control, which are bodily functions. So this challenges the broadly held idea that ideas happen abstractly in the mind, and the body is just a neat vehicle for thinking. I use pop language. It sort of sometimes makes a point clearer. Now, in my experience, this is very much the case. And as I have been talking about Capoeira Angola, it's not just me thinking this is an entire practice where there is consensus among practitioners that this is embodied philosophy, that this practice generates ideas and negotiates ideas. There are examples of embodied knowledge in the everyday that I think can help just materialize this idea a little bit more. Some also relate to cultural embodied knowledge, and some refer to more individual embodied knowledge. But the idea of personal space is not something abstract. It's something that we feel and react to in our totality. If somebody comes too close too fast, we don't just stand there and think. We tend to have a very visceral reaction. And that's just one very small example. Culturally speaking, we learn body language, and we're not necessarily told, if we're children, we're not necessarily told what gestures mean. We pick them up. And yes, this is sort of both embodied but also a kind of physical language, but understanding what gestures mean and how we respond and how we use them as ways of communicating are part of embodied knowledge. Walking is embodied knowledge. We spend the first year of our lives, at least, figuring out how balance works, how gravity works, what it means to see where I'm going. We might not have big philosophical ideas about it, but this is knowledge in our body that we sort of take for granted as we get older because we just do it. But it's still knowledge, and we can understand that that is knowledge when we try to learn something new physically. And we hit stumbling blocks usually, and we have to take a step back and really try. Judging speed when crossing a road is embodied knowledge. In that, if I go too slowly, maybe somebody will pull me if I'm younger, but I learn through doing usually how quickly or how slowly I need to cross a specific space before something happens. I don't necessarily go off and do a nice mathematical calculation. I do it through my sensory motor system, perception and action, and calculation. That is embodied knowledge. Knowing what a pinch of salt is embodied knowledge. So you see where I'm going with this, from the very small to the much bigger. I'd like to offer another culturally specific idea of embodied knowledge here. And it comes from some research Catherine Lynn Gertz did with the Anglo people in Central West Africa. They cover it's a sort of ethno-linguistic group that spans a few countries in Central West Africa. And they've got a very interesting understanding of consciousness. It is an understanding of consciousness that interlinks sensing, feeling, and doing, and interrelation in a sort of inseparable whole. So there's an example that they bring up through talking with some of the Anglo people that we're working with. And they give this example that I think is very interesting. So the example is that one woman has an injured foot, and in spite of that, she goes to a social gathering where she's expected. And she finds a seat. Now, somebody she knows has noticed that she has come there and has an injured foot. And without anything being said, she goes to the buffet table and gathers a plate of food and takes it to her, understanding that it would be too difficult for the woman with the injured foot to go get the plate of food. The way they talk about that isn't that it's a sort of separation, it's a rational process. They feel something, they feel the pain, they feel the empathy for the person's situation. And as a result, they do something to alleviate the potential suffering of this person. All of this is wrapped into one understanding of consciousness, where thinking and sensing and feeling are all part of a complex of processes that happen throughout the sensory motor system and the mind, as we understand it. And I find that useful because it describes something very human, something that we can relate to a certain degree. We might not be able to access a specific cultural context, but the situation isn't so alien, I would say. But understanding that their culture has a whole structure of understanding consciousness that is completely different to this idea of my meat suit and my mind, I think is important in trying to open up our thinking. I think I'll move on because I'm just looking at the time, if that's okay. There are more examples. There's a lovely idea around how we perceive color, and that it's neither completely in our mind and neither completely in the wavelengths of light that we receive through our eyes. But I'll move on because I think you're with me so far. Another big one, I've talked about power relations, I've talked about negotiating power. I'd like to frame power. Again, I have a very broad definition of power I work with, and it's agency to act upon a situation. And that is very, very broad, I realize. But I like to keep it broad because it necessitates relationality. It moves away from the idea of power as object, something that can be retained and held. And I'll take us back right to the beginning, where the idea of power is certain, if anything, it is that it's not fixed. This definition also opens up and includes ideas of power as domination. It also includes ideas of power as knowledge, as relation, as agency, as all sorts of things. And I find that important. In a minute, I will tell you what power is not. So this idea is also reflected in two philosophers who articulated, I think, quite astutely, and it's Arendt and Foucault. And Arendt is very interesting when she talks about power because it is very much about coming together, very much about relationship. The fact that she talks about power as the human ability not to just act, but to act in concert, I think is quite important, because that means that power is never the property of an individual. It is always something that happens with a group. Equally, Foucault articulates a similar idea, that power is employed and exercised, not owned. It is exercised through a net-like organization. Very crucially, individuals are the vehicles of power and not its points of application. So power in that sense really is agency. I'm the vehicle of power. And this is quite an important distinction, because to both Foucault and Arendt, to exercise power on someone isn't actually power. That is domination, and that actually is violence. Arendt is very good at basically saying that the point at which power becomes fixed turns it into violence. And I'll come to that second quote in a second, because I think it's actually very, very indicative of Capoeira. Oh, sorry, I need to slow down a bit. So, both for Foucault and Arendt, power is enabling. It is agency, it is life-giving, it is what we can do together. Violence is the opposite of power, really. As I said, when power becomes fixed, when those in a position of power dominate and fix the relationships between people, we're talking about violence. And this is subtle, but it's actually quite important. Because I'll go to Arendt now, who says, politically speaking, the point is that loss of power becomes a temptation to substitute violence for power. So if I am in a position of power and that position of power is threatened, if I resort to violence, I am actually losing whatever power I have. because there is no longer an ability to negotiate and act together or even play around with power. So, as a reflection of that, in capoeira, negotiating power within a context of play affords players the opportunity to take risks, explore tactics, and process attacks and defeats in a controlled and extra daily space. What do I mean by this? I use the frame of play to distinguish power play or power dynamics in social life and in extra daily life. The idea of the play circle, as articulated by Nzinga, talks about crossing a threshold from our daily lives into a special ritual space that allows play to happen, because it is voluntary, because it is guided by certain rules. So, capoeira is a circle of play. So we really leave our social roles behind, we leave the rules of life to the side a little bit and enter into a microcosm of play where we can really test our agency within a fairly defined but not very fixed language of movement and music. Time, okay, I have to go quite quickly. So, in my research on trying to understand what drives power play in Capoeira Angola, I've identified these principles, and they're quite broad, but they're taken from my analysis of the games, of the practice. So, choice is quite a central driver for power play in general, but in Capoeira Angola more specifically. Interactions are improvised. So I talk of a movement language where we have a number of movements that we learn to do, but how and when we deploy them and in what order is completely open. That's why I keep coming back to the idea of language. So I always have a choice. Do I attack? Do I defend? How do I attack? Do I want to play more expressively to try and side my opponent out? What do I do? Do I want to break the game into a sort of game within a game? That moment that you saw in the two games. It's a game within a game. It sort of breaks the flow and opens up other possibilities. These are all choices. Attempting dominance we've already talked about. This is central to driving power play. If I try to dominate my partner, I am already engaging in power negotiations. I cannot be too collaborative or too competitive, otherwise it falls apart. And this is actually quite an interesting point. Within the sphere of play, gameplay can become heated. Real kicks and real headbutts and real sweeps are exchanged and sometimes connect. And that's fine, actually. This is part of the language. But there is a fine line between that and violence, which takes us back to some of the ideas I just mentioned. If somebody becomes too dominant, if somebody really starts hitting relentlessly, if somebody throws a punch, collectively, people stop the game. Because there is a very clear understanding collectively that that's violence, that's no longer power play. It's fixed, and it's violent. Because the person has no longer a clear choice about what to do. So, again, this is not done verbally. We see it in act. We understand through doing and observing what is going on. Often the game is stopped with an action, not necessarily with a voice. Part of the power play is adaptation, adapting to the situation. Choice is one thing, but I might have an idea that I want to do this now, but what is being given to me is not what I'm expecting. the ability for me to adapt and find other options for what to do are again quite important to keep the flow of the game and to perpetuate power play. Play and ambiguity, you've probably already thought about. The ambiguity of who has power, who does not. How violent and threatening to be, because I can pretend I intend something when I don't do it, are all part of the tactics that we can use to assert dominance. Whether that works or not depends on both our partner and the people around us. Because their attention and their belief or disbelief in what we do also affects what we do. So, in all that playfulness, there is a lot of ambiguity, and we take advantage of the ambiguity. It is also a very performative practice. So again, I perform weakness, or I perform power, or I perform femininity or masculinity. And none of that has to match what my appearance is. And that can give me an advantage in my play. And I can switch it if it doesn't. So I'm not just deploying direct or specific movements. I am thinking expressively. I am working through action with ideas of gender, of social perception, of social status. And I am choosing how to perform these. In addition to this, inversion becomes not just a physical tactic to move around or to confuse, it becomes a symbolic practice of turning the tides, of the world upside down, of the carnivalesque in what we think of the world. I'm going very quickly here, I realize, but I want to leave enough time to talk. And within all that, I've already touched upon the idea of faking, dissimulation. I pretend to do one thing when I intend to do another. This idea of dissimulation is so deeply embedded in capoeira that we still think about doing it, but it is as natural as walking within the game. I need to be able to fake. I need to be able to pretend or to hide my intentions so that I can temporarily deceive my partner, so that I can take advantage. But again, they're also trying to do the same thing. So it's a very, it's an impossible situation of trying to figure out what is going on and still trying to have an advantage. Symbolically, this is also important because it reflects a lot of the survival tactics of Afro-Brazilians during slavery. Feigning compliance so that they can have an easier time surviving. Feigning conversion to Christianity when all they're doing is substituting the names of their own deities with names of Christian saints. That's not simulation, I don't know what is. So it's so central to how we play that it becomes part of every physical expression, whether it's a feigned kick or a feigned smile, or even a feigned friendliness, or a feigned murderous intent. And of course that relates to performativity. So that none of these things works in isolation. There are elements of each in the others. But I wanted to share this because it gives you a sense of the complexity of thinking that happens within this arena of play. Excuse me. I hope I haven't gone too quickly. And this is maybe the crux of the point. Why is this even important? Why are we talking about power play? Why is it so crucial to so many of us who go out of our way to practice this? A lot of capoeiristas, people who practice capoeira, will talk about the circle of capoeira as a microcosm. Although it is in the ritual sphere of play, and although it has specific rules, implicit and explicit, because of its contradictions, because of its power play, because also of the fact that it's humans playing, trying to dominate one another, we often talk about the Roda as reflecting the bigger world, the macrocosm, in its cruelty and its beauty and its surprise and its chaos and its constant changing. In social life, we're not all in a position where we have all the freedom to act as we'd like. We don't necessarily have as much power as we'd like. Some of us are freer than others. And in the case of Capoeira Angola, it comes from a place of unfreedom. So the ability to reflect these injustices in the game, while I'm actually at the same time claiming my agency, making myself present and active in this claiming of agency with others, has huge implications in terms of how I can then leave the order with new ideas about how I can feign my way, or perform my way, or jump my way through situations. So perhaps I'm overstating it, although from my personal perspective I'm not. Capoeira has changed my life. If it wasn't for Capoeira, I would not be here talking to you. And it's not because I've managed to do some research on it, it's because it's changed the way I think. And it's changed the way I think about what is possible. Most Capoeira Angola practitioners won't be necessarily, most of the old teachers will not be highly educated. Some still don't know how to read and write. They come from a very difficult time in Brazil. So it's not like there's academic discourse, philosophical discourse around what capoeira affords. This is something we learn through practice. And I know you have to go on my work here. But here we are. I can't spend years playing with you so we can agree on this, although I'd love to. But back to this idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm. Playing with power in a controlled way gives me time to reflect on how else I understand power in other contexts. We often talk about play as training for the real world. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, I guess. But for me, capoeira does give me a training in life because it brings me into communion, actually, with myself, my own limitations, my own fears, my own nervousness. But it also brings me into confrontation in play with another person, also trying to achieve the same things, more or less. There's nobody there to guide me. I have to find how to negotiate that conversation in movement. I have to think on my feet, on my hands. Because it's done through the body, it has a profound effect on my mind, because I know it through every molecule of my being. So I leave the roda and I am a changed person. Maybe not once, maybe not twice, maybe over a year or a few years of practice, things shift. Importantly, I want to talk a little bit about play and how games in general can help analyze, unpack, and critically engage with the world around us. And this is not just me saying, it's going to bring more people into it. So, Turner talks about the wheel of play. He says, the wheel of play reveals to us the possibility of changing our goals and therefore the restructuring of what our culture states to be reality. Through games, we can rethink, we can replay. Mary Flanagan, in fact, talks about unplaying, reskinning, and rewriting the games we are given to reflect our desires or issues with reality itself. Games come out of cultural contexts. They are not abstract creations usually. They reflect specific values of a time or place. So how we engage with games also affords us opportunities to rethink what these games are asking of us. And by extension, the idea of unplaying the game can give us an opportunity to unplay reality, to rewrite or to reskill. That is quite momentous as a realization, because it is possible. And I'm going to. It's a little bit nice right now. Yes.